welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, I'll be going through some first drafts and questions you guys have provided on Twitter and YouTube. So we'll be delving into kind of the live reactions from you guys following the launch of the game yesterday and what this means for our F1 fantasy teams heading into the first deadline this weekend in Australia. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I'll jump into the Q&A section first for this video based on a tweet I put out a couple of days ago asking for any questions that you guys had in the community around the game and changes to the gameplay for this season. So in terms of pricing, Mike's asked, can you talk about all of the info from the pricing for what is in the F1 Fantasy Tools Discord? And a huge revelation that came out just before the game launched and well after it was what the community had been able to understand in terms of the price changes for this season and what that could mean for building budget, our team structures and such moving forward. And there's a lot to unpack. I'll be completely honest. I haven't got my head fully around everything yet in terms of what this means for our teams, price changes and scoring in the game. But I've got a snapshot of a pinned message on what the community, I believe, has understood means for price changes for tier A drivers above 20 million and tier B drivers under 20 million, and how a great, a good, a poor or a terrible performance can dictate a price change week to week. Now, there's a lot, I admit, that I haven't yet fully comprehended yet, but the kind of key takeaways so far that I've gleaned is that based on the rolling 3 race average of drivers and constructors, the price change will be dictated by their recent form. And you can see here further down what that looks like for the price change for a driver or a constructor over that 3 race period. So I won't read all of this from top to bottom, but I will essentially point out that it's a very different price change model to what we had 12 months ago and for the last 2 seasons, where assets were grouped into an A, a B and a C tier. This year it's only 2 tiers, and the price changes are not nearly as significant as what they might have been in prior years. So I think that has a lot of different repercussions for our fantasy teams. What that looks like right now, I guess we don't fully know, simply because of the fact we need at least 3 races worth of data to analyze those price changes, what it means from a metric of great, good, poor or terrible performance, and how that feeds into our budget building approach week to week. I think in summary, it probably means the jumps in value are going to be less. The ability to get to a premium team or top heavy premium team within about 4 or 5 races won't be quite as likely as what we've seen in the years past. But I think there's still going to be a way to build budget. But I think it is, again, a matter of identifying those assets that are going to go up in value, as we've seen every race, every season type thing. So that is it in a nutshell. But if you want to keep up to date on all of these developments, be sure to join the Discord on F1 Fantasy Tools. The other thing I want to quickly talk about is another question that Alexander raised. Is Carlos Sainz worth 13 million? I think that's a question a few people have had in terms of pricing the game. I think it's hard to say right away. I think Williams looked very good in preseason testing, and if Sainz and Albon can really capitalize on that single lap pace, if it converts to long run performance, then I certainly think P5s, P6s on a consistent basis are within reach. I wouldn't say right now I'm confident that Sainz will be featuring in the top 5 every race weekend, just simply because of that logjam we have among the Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull and Mercedes teams. But I do think there is a world in which if the Williams is as good as they expect within the garage, that it could translate to high points finishes for Carlos Sainz. And I think at 13 million, he has to be scoring around 15 points most races to make his price tag worthwhile. I just think with the constructor situation where most people are still angling towards 2 premiums at the moment, I think it is going to be very hard to accommodate a driver like Sainz. But we will have to wait and see to understand whether or not having him in our team is very much viable. In terms of scoring, the Dirty Side of the Track podcast, who I've been on a few times, wants to understand some of the scoring changes and what pit stop, changes mean for the game itself. Now, it is a huge change, I think, to F1 Fantasy to introduce pit stops to make all drivers all constructors viable. But I put up a graph from Adam from the Fantasy Formula, a friend of mine, and a show I have a lot of love for. But I think this graph is quite telling in terms of where Red Bull sits as a dominant asset in the game. They've always been very good at pit stops, I'll be honest. But what stood out to me was that the additional points from the 2025 rules doesn't actually benefit Red Bull quite as much as I initially thought. You've got 99 extra points that they would have been able to bank last year compared to a team like Mercedes, who have historically never been that great at the pits, but they've only secured 88 by comparison to Red Bull's 99. So I think even though Red Bull will consistently be at the forefront of pit stop points, I don't think the rule changes actually benefit them as much as I might have thought they would. It still is very much weighted towards the top teams because we know they're much better in the pits than the midfield and the back marker teams. You look at Haas, for example, only 48 points compared to some of the top teams in the 80s. But I do think there is a case to consider other constructors, and I don't think just because Red Bull are so good in the pits does it make them necessarily a lock from the outset. So it is, I guess, a consideration to be made, but I'm not necessarily sure that it is an absolute must to have Red Bull simply because of how quick they are in the pits. Now, Marcelo also asked, again, does it mean getting in teams like Ferrari and Red Bull, who have been very good in the pits, and sacrificing on early budget gains, as well as a 2X driver to capitalize on that? Like I said, there's probably at most 15 points per team most race weeks. And I don't think there's really a world where having Sainz or Alonso or Albon is viable to have Ferrari and Red Bull. You'd have to go for an Antonelli or a Lawson potentially in that 2X slot. The first few races of the season doesn't exactly fill me with a lot of confidence having a rookie on the 2X. But again, it really depends on whether or not you think the stock is in the pit stops. I'm not entirely convinced it is worth that sacrifice. But again, I'd have to really see how those pit stop points shake out week to week. And Red Bull, if they are consistently delivering like they were in the first half of last season, then it may be a situation where we do have to pivot away to an Antonelli or a Lawson in that 2X position. So I think a lot to consider there. And again, we just don't have the data until probably about 3 or 4 races into to make an informed judgment. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm leaning towards having 2 premium constructors from the outset. Again, Williams could throw a spanner in the works in practice. But Dan and the Bearded Beast have both asked, is there really a situation where having 2 constructors, top tier constructors, is essential? And I think we've seen the last couple of seasons, 2 premium constructors are the building blocks of F1 fantasy and scoring points. It provides a really nice, safe baseline for scoring points. I think that's very much going to continue. Obviously, pointed out before on the pit stops that all of the top teams will have more fantasy points in the pit stops. They're always going to be featuring on the podium in the high points. So I think that doesn't really change this year. But there is, as Book has asked, possible situations where a B tier constructor may be viable if it means running someone like Norris in the 2X slot over, say, a Piastri or a George Russell. Now, I'm not entirely sure yet if I will be starting out with Norris, simply because his price means you absolutely have to run a B-tier constructor under 20 million to bring him in with another premium constructor. And I think, again, if you're looking to build budget, then Williams, Alpine, Haas, perfectly fine. But right now, there's just too much uncertainty around those midfield teams for me to confidently say going against 2 premium constructors is a great decision. But again, I think you could see a spanner in the works in free practice from Alpine or Williams that makes it viable. So I think, we'll go through some draft lineups, and we've got Williams in one of them to obviously dissect and see what that means for our fantasy teams. So I've got a few drafts to go through. I'll also bring up the team selections and options on the F1 Fantasy website too, so you can get, I guess, a flavour for deviating for the ones on screen here. But this is one that stood out to me simply because, again, I've talked about Oscar as a great 2X option. I think home ground advantage, got the crowd behind him. He's recently re-signed with McLaren. I think there are a lot of good omens for him this weekend. I think Haas, again, talked about it in my initial reactions video. I think Behrman and Ocon are very much underpriced. I don't think there's too many drivers around that price I'd actually choose over either of those two drivers. I was talking to Rain Fantasy earlier today around, someone like Alonso, who at 8.8 I think could be good value, but I'd still probably choose Ocon over Alonso if I had to choose between the two. And so for that reason, they're both on the screen here, but I think Haas is really good value at what they've been priced at. And we saw last year, they got so many laps in at testing, they were running at the bottom, which happened again this year, but it turned out in 2024, they had a really good car, great race pace, and Magnussen and Hülkenberg were extremely competitive in F1 Fantasy. So, if Ikematsu is cooking something up, I think Ocon and Behrman could be excellent options in F1 Fantasy. And then we've got Hadjar and Bortoletto simply because of their enabling price to allow us to bring in Piastri and two premium constructors. Now, Red Bull I've got here, and again, this lineup's kind of based on the fact that Red Bull are very good in the pits. So that's kind of the reason why I've elected to move towards them at the moment. If I bring up the team on the screen here, so this was the one that I just had up, and I think that was, if we go down here, that was Alonso, and then that should be, if my constructor tab wants to work, that should be Red Bull. That's what I've got up for team number one, draft number one. Now, if I wanted to move away from Red Bull into Ferrari, that gives me 7.7 and enough for, as I pointed out, someone like Ollie Behrman or Jack Doohan. I think Jack's perfectly fine as well. That Alpine looks pretty competitive at the moment. So there's certainly variations of these team skeletons to go with. I think Mercedes, for me, even though I don't really see them on the same level as a Ferrari or a McLaren, just because of their price in F1 Fantasy among the top constructors, makes it very easy to enable this kind of lineup from the outset. Obviously, I think we want some McLaren coverage. Oscar's obviously the best we can do with this lineup. We can't stretch to McLaren with Oscar unless we ran a C tier, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I think this is a really nice lineup to set the tone for the first draft. Now, another combination I wanted to look at was a non-Oscar Piastri but McLaren constructor build. And what I really like about this one is simply because you're doubling up on not just Piastri's points, but Lando Norris's as well. And I think Lando is, to me, a driver at his price that seems very out of reach, if I'm being honest. I think he is someone that, despite the fact that last year we saw a lot of driver of the days, 29 million feels quite unattainable if you want to run two premium constructors. It's actually impossible. We can't do that. So for that reason, I chose to go down the route of keeping the McLaren constructor instead of going for Piastri, go for someone slightly more affordable in George Russell. Again, obviously talked about the Haas duo and the two budget enablers in Hadjar and Bortoletto, and keeping the Mercedes constructor in play as well. So I think George, probably not enough talked about him, and I think he's flown under the radar a little bit, I'll be honest, in F1 Fantasy. There's been a lot of other, popular picks in the game, which I think is quite telling with how good the developers have priced the drivers and constructors this year. I'll bring, my screen's kind of wigging out a little bit, but hopefully we can still see everyone. This is the second team on the screen here. George Russell is the second lowest owned driver in the game after Lance Stroll at 8%. Now, I think George deserves a bit more credit at Melbourne. I know Mercedes have not really challenged for the title the last couple of years, but we saw how good they were in the cold weather last year, and it's forecasted for about 90% rain on Sunday in Melbourne. It looks great outside at the moment where I am, but I think the weather is expected to turn come the Grand Prix. And we saw how good George was in Las Vegas, in Canada, in Spa, all cold conditions or cooler climates where Mercedes were actually really able to get into that window and fire up the tires. So, if they're able to continue that trend into Albert Park, I think he could be a sneaky good 2X option. And then obviously, as I talked about, kind of Mercedes and McLaren to beef up the constructors there. So I really like this kind of team. I think there's some variation of the Team 1 we were looking at just before. But again, if you want to move towards McLaren Constructor and get a bit of that Lando Norris production, which you obviously wouldn't have in Draft 1, I think this is a perfectly good road to go down. Now, Draft 3 is where it gets a little bit more spicy. And to be honest, I wouldn't say I'm going all in on this at the moment. Like I said before about Williams, we really want to see more from Albon and Sainz in all 3 free practice sessions this week to be wholly convinced that Williams are the real deal. We did have a similar situation 12 months ago where in preseason testing, VCARB looked really good. And, you know, I myself, I'll own up to it, made a mistake of running the RB team. I think it was the RB Constructor and one of Ricciardo or Tsunoda, and that completely flopped. I think B tier or the under 20 million assets, they are a bit of a crapshoot simply just because we just have no idea what to expect week to week from them. I think Williams are going to close the gap to the top teams, but by how much, I'm not entirely sure. But look, let's put that to one side for the minute. The reason I chose to go down this route was simply because, again, Williams, if they are kind of a top 5 team, could be excellent value at 13.1 million. We've got Piastri and the McLaren Constructor, obviously doubling up on Oscar as a 2x. And again, in the McLaren Constructor and his production there, plus Lando Norris's, of course. And to go for a driver like Alonso, I talked about him in my initial reactions video. A lot of it depends on Adrian Newey's impact with Aston Martin. Right now, I'm not completely convinced he's going to be taking that team back to the promised land like we saw a couple of seasons ago. But in reality, could be someone who makes a bit of magic if the car looks good. So I think Alonso for now, and then I've got Albon in here as well. You know, I'd prefer Carlos Sainz if I had to choose between the 2 Williams drivers, but just simply because of budget restrictions, I've gone for Albon. I'm not saying he's going to match Sainz like for like in fantasy production, but I think he covers him just based on his price alone. So doubling up on Williams assets, doubling up on McLaren assets. Then we've got Ollie Behrman in the Haas, and I was like, Hadjar. Hadjar could also be a Gabriel Bortoleto or kind of any other budget enabler within obvious reason of that. So I'm just going to quickly, again, we'll tinker a little bit with this team on the screen. We'll see what we can do. And, you know, if it's not Williams, you could also go down the road of getting in an Alpine. Now, again, at 15%, they've probably been not written off, but not as many people are jumping towards them as perhaps I would have expected. Gasly looks great in that car, but I'm just not sure kind of in terms of what we have for budget, which again, I can't see, but we could, you know, instead of Alonso, could we stretch to Pierre Gasly? I really don't mind that at all. Or instead, go for Sainz in the second slot, which leaves us with enough. I wouldn't go near Yuki, but you could obviously keep Alonso. You can upgrade Hadjar to Jack Doohan if you wanted, or any of these other guys under 7.2 million. So a little bit more flexibility, and I kind of like this. I wouldn't call it a triple header, but Piastri, Sainz, and Alonso, all very experienced drivers. It's a wet weather race. That's the kind of reliability you want, not just in these conditions, but also for optimizing your price gain likelihood from these kind of assets. So that's the C tier, or not the C tier. I need to stop saying that. The budget constructor option for the third draft, and I will do one more. Again, I'm probably boring you to death with different drafts, but I wanted to give you some optionality of the different combinations we go through. This isn't one I personally thought about. I did check this out as one of the optimal teams on F1 Fantasy Tools, and I didn't, because we've obviously only got 3 teams we can use in F1 Fantasy. Wasn't one for me that I pulled out and thought instantly this is what I want. But going through it top to bottom, again, don't need to talk about Oscar Piastri and the Haas duo too much, or Bortoleto for that matter. It's Ferrari and Mercedes is the constructor combination that I've really got my eyes on. Ferrari, again, covers off the pit stops. They were one of the best teams in the pits last year. And, you know, they are projected on F1 Fantasy Tools to have the second highest This is early sim, so I'll bring it up on screen just quickly now. But Ferrari do have the bottom right hand corner. For some reason, my mouse, I could actually just drag it up here. Over on the right here, Ferrari have the second most expected points in Australia, 63.2, ahead of Red Bull and Mercedes. Obviously, the second highest price constructor as well. But I do think this is one such option that covers off Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. And you're still obviously covering off McLaren through Oscar Piastri. In many of these situations, we have, unless you've got the constructor, very little coverage of McLaren. So, and Lando Norris, I should say. So it is going to be a bit tricky to navigate that, even if Lando wins. But I don't think he's got as much of a mortgage on the driver of the day as he probably did last year. So as a result of that, I think his viability owning him outright is certainly reduced in the driver department. But yeah, this is one other combination. Again, I think we're getting into a territory where these are all very small variations of one driver here, two constructors there type thing. But I want to give you guys enough of an idea on these certain drafts so you can go into the deadline with a few different options. But I think a lot of this will evolve as soon as we get to free practice on Friday and Saturday. So keep your eyes peeled for the race pace and quality pace simulation and what these drivers are stacking up in terms of times come the end of the week. But hopefully this gives you guys a bit of food for thought. I'll be back again with another video tomorrow, team selection and race week preview and final thoughts later in the week. So stay tuned and do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But as always, guys, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.